video, we looked at Part 2, Question and Response, and discussed the strategies necessary to solve that part of the test. We also recognized that the Toeic will use many of the same tricks found in Part 1, Photographs, while having the additional disadvantage of not being able to see any visual information. In our video today, we'll be looking at Part 3, Conversations. Again, we'll be using sample questions from the Toeic Examinee Handbook, but please, for the moment, don't look at this download right now. We'll be analyzing the transcript a little bit later in the video. And please also remember that during the test, there is no note-taking, so please don't also take notes in this part of the test either, part of the video. So the instructions for Part 3 is that you will hear conversations between two people. You will be asked to answer 3 questions about what the speakers say in each conversation. You will have to select the best answer by choosing A, B, C, or D on your answer sheet. The conversations will not be printed in your test book and will be spoken only one time. Now, first off, this is what you will see on the actual test booklet. You will actually see the questions and the answer choices that follow. Now, before we actually listen, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about a little hint that would be necessary. And that's the fact, of course, that we can see information on this part of the test. If you recall, questions and responses, the Toeic did not provide any visual information. But in Part 3, we are given the questions and the answer choices to look at. Now, this can be an advantage and a disadvantage, which we'll be exploring a little bit later in this video. So, for now, I'm going to instruct you to just look at the questions only. Before you listen, you will be given a very short amount of time to look through the questions and answer choices, but I'm going to encourage you to try to focus more on the questions themselves and not on the answer selections. Now, as you will see after we complete this activity, the listening activity, many of the wrong answer choices or distractors will definitely try to distract you. So, in this case, just use the questions to point you to the important information you're listening to. So now let's get ready to listen. Find a piece of paper and just number 41, 42, and 43. This will give you a chance to feel like what it's like during the test. So what I will do is place the questions and answer choices on the screen again during this listening time. So as you listen, take a look at the questions. I'll give you a moment to briefly look at them. Now let's begin.
I think I'll have to take the train to the regional sales meeting up in the city next week.
Don't you usually drive when you go to those meetings? I thought you didn't like to take the train.
I don't, but the highway's being repaired, and I'm afraid I might be late if I have to make a detour through an area I don't know very well.
You're right, and it'll be expensive to park up there, too. Question 41. Why is the woman going to the city? Question 42. How will she get there? Question 43. What is the problem? Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at the answers. So, in question 41, why is she going to the city? The answer is B, to go to a meeting. 42, how will she get there? C, by train. Question 43, what is the problem? The answer is D, the roads are being fixed. Now, let's take a moment to look at the conversation. Throughout the second half of this video, we'll be looking at parts of the conversation to try to analyze and understand its organization. But first off, you will notice that in the conversation, basically, we have two people, man and a woman, and essentially the conversation itself is only just a couple of exchanges. The woman speaks first, then the woman speaks again, and then the man. So the first thing we have to think about, economy is important in this section. What we're saying here is that the speakers need to get to the point fairly quickly. So what you'll notice is this first speaker, the person who usually speaks right away, usually expresses some kind of problem. Now, the second speaker, on the other hand, is there just to help kind of guide the speaker, to help explain the problem in greater detail. Now, let's examine this a little more carefully. So notice at the very beginning, the woman says that, I think I'll have to take the train to the regional sales meeting. So immediately we get the speaker's problem, their dilemma. I think I'll have to take the train. So first off, notice that we're not beginning a conversation in a logical place, such as people saying hello to each other or greeting each other. No, it's basically the person beginning with their problem. Now notice how the second speaker sort of guides the first speaker to explain more. Well, don't you usually drive when you go to those meetings? So in this case, the speaker is basically giving the woman more opportunity to explain why the person is not driving, but instead taking the train. And then, of course, there are other sorts of various tricks here. For example, notice how the person says, I thought you didn't like to take the train. So even then, it's very difficult for us to catch the first time who exactly doesn't like the train, or if, in fact, anyone does. So this does bring us to our first kind of hint in thinking about how is this conversation actually structured? Well, we discussed that the first person speaks, then the second person speaks, and so on. So this brings the question, is this actually a real conversation? Well, again, in parts 3 and 4, you will see that oftentimes the situations are not real. They kind of start off with the topic and then perhaps go off in different directions. Because really, the speakers involved will always address the topic or purpose at hand very quickly. So in our example, notice the questions the second speaker is asking, while they might be realistic, are really there just to help the first person explain his or her problem. So therefore, many of the questions on the test will most likely be about the person with the problem or situation, not the other person. So keep in mind, in a real conversation, we often have people changing directions or sometimes talking about one person and then talking about another. But in this case, it's really more about a person explaining his or her problem. Now again, notice in the questions here. Look at the questions again. Why is the woman going to the city? How will she get there? What is the problem? Well, in this case, you probably noticed that the questions do occur in the order that they happen in the conversation, and that's very helpful. But they are also about the basic details of the woman's problem. Where is she going? What is the problem? None of these involves the other speaker. This is very common on the Toeic, unless both speakers are sharing the same problem. Perhaps they're co-workers and they're trying to fix a copying machine. That would be a situation to where both people would be involved in discussing the problem, and both of them might have particular ideas or opinions. But in this case, it's really more about one person explaining his or her problem, and then the other person just asking questions about it. Now, getting to the actual answer choices. This is one of the things we notice that could be a potential disadvantage on the test. The distractors. Again, we discussed in our very first video back in the reading series that distractors are those answer choices that basically are wrong, but they're wrong for many different ways. So again, in this situation, even though we can see the answer choices, notice how they're trying to distract you even while you listen. So at the outset, we mentioned that there are advantages and disadvantages, but some of the advantages and disadvantages are a little different. Some of these tricks are new, and some of these are, of course, old. So first off, let's look at some of the new tricks this time. A trick that we're going to refer to as partially correct information. Now, in the question and response section, we saw how the test would use words that might have different meanings in different contexts. For example, one of the tricks we noticed in the previous video was the fact that to meet a person isn't necessarily the same as going to a meeting room. The words themselves look the same, or at least have a similarity, but they don't necessarily mean the same in this context. So now in this particular part of the test, we've expanded this a little bit more. Since we have more information, now the idea might be that a distractor could have partially correct information. And in fact, notice that the incorrect answer choices have much, if not most, of the information correct, except for maybe one word or idea. Now, this is not true for every question, but many of them do. So, for example, in number 41, why is the woman going to the city? You will notice that in choices A and C, there are some pieces of information that are partially correct. She was going to attend something, and it did have the word sale in it. These two ideas are basically correct, except they're obviously not referring to the correct context. Getting a car repaired, again, we did mention a car. We did mention something being repaired. So part of the information is correct, except for the fact that the car is not being repaired. It was the highway that was being repaired. Of course, we have an older trick, which is something we'll take a look at, and that is in D, we have the word tour, which sounds a lot like the word detour, which was used in the conversation. So, again, our old tricks is that we will see from time to time similar sounding words. But our new tricks involve a little bit more listening, and especially paying more attention. So these new tricks of partially correct information will appear more often, starting with this section of the test. Okay, now 42 is a little more straightforward when we think about the partially correct information. Well, again, for example, the fact that a car was mentioned. So again, choosing an answer choice like this can be distracting if we're not necessarily paying attention to the fact that the person couldn't take the car but had to travel by train. Question 43, though, is a little bit more difficult. Now, why is that? Well, first off, it does involve putting together a little bit more information. It's not just listening for one particular word or idea. It actually is thinking about describing the problem that's being discussed. Of course, the problem doesn't occur until almost the end of the conversation, which will happen in a lot of Toeic conversations. But why is this one a little more difficult? Well, first off, we have to process a lot of information and do it quickly. And as we said before, there are a lot of the answer choices that kind of have some similar or partially correct information. Now, let's break down the distractors and see where the tricks can be. For example, in A, the trains are often late. Well, again, this is tricky because the speaker is taking a train. And we know from our personal experience that sometimes trains can be late. Of course, that depends on the country you're coming from, but just in case, sometimes it might happen. In B, we did talk about the fact that there is a meeting, and we often know that sometimes it is possible that meetings can get canceled. So notice in this case, we are processing information, but also getting that information wrong. So a lot of things to pay attention to in B. C is probably one of the most Toeic-like tricks on the test. It has some partially correct information. So for example, something was expensive, but it wasn't the tour. And of course, tour was the other trick. It was a similar sounding word. It was detour. So notice in each one of these, finding the answer was a little bit more difficult. Of course, the answer is D. But the idea here is that in each one of these, there's something that might be correct. We just have to get the information correct completely. So this brings us to our final point in the video, and that's talking about the importance of processing information. Now we're going to talk more about this in our final video when the listening passages get even longer. But the idea here is that we have to recognize completely accurate information. Now what this means is on the Toeic, oftentimes the correct answer will not involve the exact same words. So again, if you think about the correct answer again, the roads are being fixed. Well, again, in the conversation, they use the word repaired. So the idea here is that we have to recognize that a synonym is being used. A synonym, of course, is a word that has a similar meaning. So starting with this section of the test, it will now become more and more important to recognize words and ideas of similar meaning. And really the idea is your ability to do this quickly will help you find the correct answer. So our final thoughts. As we mentioned before, this part of the test, the conversations themselves are not real conversations. They're usually just an opportunity for one speaker to help explain a problem or situation, and for the other speaker to help kind of guide the conversation along. Now, we did note that this is different if both speakers share the same problem. Of course, we saw that many of the same tricks from the first two parts apply. We could see words that have similar sound, or words or ideas that are perhaps being used in the wrong context. but some new tricks involve answer choices that may contain some of the first two, and of course partially correct information, which involves an ability to process information quickly. And this again will be something we discuss more in our final video. So finally, the key is to understand what synonyms are and to how to recognize them very quickly. So the questions themselves are visible on this section of the test, along with the answer choices. The questions follow the order of the conversation. They usually involve the basic details of the passage. And the answer choices, again, as we mentioned, are also visible, but oftentimes we should not pay attention to them during the listening passage, because they will distract you. And finally, remember that on the Toeic, there's still no note-taking. Once again, there are lots of great recommended materials out there to help you prepare for the test. The official Toeic website is a great source. The Tactics for Toeic textbook series by Grant True, especially the listening and reading part, and our new TOEFL Toeic preparation website can be found at the bottom of the video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Video 4, Listening Part 4 and Review.